Hello, I'm Mark Selleck and welcome to this interview episode, The Early History of Rome, with the Partial Historians. So, I wanted to do an episode that focused on Rome in the same sort of format I had done with my past Greek Periphery episodes, though my knowledge on Roman history is quite rusty at best. So I wanted to enlist some help to present this episode. For this I turned to Dr. Fiona Radford and Dr. Peta Greenfield from the Partial Historians podcast. Unfortunately, the timing didn't line up with the series of Periphery episodes I had done, but nevertheless, I still wanted to present this look at Rome, so I decided to present this episode as part of the interview series, where we'll take a quick break from our narrative. Like I said, this episode is done with a similar idea as the past Greek Periphery episodes, where we look back to some of the earliest times in the region we are focusing on. We then move forward exploring the tales and myths surrounding the foundations, before then turning to what more tangible lines of evidence tells us. This will then see discussion move into areas where we then have more literary accounts that help provide an idea of what was developing. I thought it would be interesting to focus on the city of Rome, rather than the larger regions we had done before, since Rome is such a well-known city of the ancient world, though I also wanted to compare its developments to what was taking place in Greece around the same periods. In this episode with Dr. Greenfield and Dr. Radford from the Partial Historians, we follow this same formula, where we then look at parallels to compare what was taking place in Greece to help provide some context to the developments in Rome. Instead of looking at Rome over a series of episodes, like the previous Periphery episodes, we follow the foundation all the way through to the beginning of the Republic in this talk stretching for just over an hour and a half. This also coincides with roughly the same period we brought all our other looks at the wider Greek world up to. Dr. Fiona Radford is an expert on Rome on film and wrote her thesis on Kubrick's Spartacus. Her research interest in film makes her an exponent not only in ancient history, but also reception studies. Dr. Radford's work has also taken her across the globe and into rarely viewed archives. Dr. Peta Greenfield is an expert on the Vestal Virgins, a collection of 6 priestesses, whose temple was located at the edge of the Roman Forum. Her research interests include the intersection between religion and politics in Rome, the late Republic and Augustan period, and the role of women. Together, both Dr. Greenfield and Dr. Radford produce and present the Partial Historians podcast, where they discuss, spar, and laugh their way through different aspects of the Roman world. They would love to have you along for the ride, and you can find them wherever you get your podcasts. Without further ado, let's get on with the early history of Rome with the Partial Historians. All right, thank you, Dr. Greenfield and Dr. Radford, for coming onto the show to talk to us about the early history and development of Rome. It's great to have you here.
Thank you so much for having us.
It is an absolute pleasure. Looking forward to it. We love ancient Rome, and early Rome is particularly fascinating. So looking forward to delving in.
Yeah, sounds good. Now, before we get started in our talk, I just want to outline, my thinking and reasoning behind why I wanted to do this episode today, looking at Rome and inviting you both on. In the series, I'd recently gone off on a bit of a digression from my main narrative, where I started looking at areas in the Greek Periphery that were going to feature more heavily in Greece during the Archaic and Classical periods. Now, I looked at areas such as Sicily, Thrace, Macedonia, and Anatolia, but I hadn't really focused in on a specific, city, so to say. But as I was finishing up that look at those digressions, I got thinking about Rome a bit more and its early history, and was deciding whether I should do an episode around that as well. Even though it wouldn't enter in, the Greek world as heavily as these other regions by, the Greek and Persian wars, I still thought it'd be an interesting area to look at anyway. Another reason I wanted to do this was to highlight, the development stages of Rome compared to what was happening in Greece at the same periods. Often when we talk, when Rome's brought up, people tend to think of this great mighty empire, but that was well after the classical age in Greece had ended. So I thought it'd be interesting just for my listeners and myself to understand how Rome developed and being able to compare it to what was happening in Greece around the same periods, given what we've covered in the series so far. And that brings me to why I'd reached out to both of you to come on and help us with this. Firstly, my Roman history is very rusty, with it being many years since I looked into Roman history. And I'm sure you can appreciate when you have a certain topic that you focus on, it's very difficult to find time to look at other areas. And secondly, you both present an excellent series that looks at Roman history, I'd been listening for some time now, and it became obvious to me that if I was going to do this episode, I would be reaching out to the both of you. So with that, I thought we could spend a little bit of time to begin with to get to know both of you and your show, The Partial Historians.
We'd be delighted.
No worries. So could you share with us a bit about, I guess, your backgrounds and what led to your fascination in ancient history?
Oh, yes. So I started off actually going into ancient history thinking I'd be a Greek historian. That ended up being a mistake for me. Not that I don't like Greek history. I actually love Greek history, but I ended up specializing in the Romans. And there was something about the Romans for me that was particularly fascinating, something about their politics. And there are lots of ways in which Greek history and Roman history end up dovetailing with each other as time goes on. So for me, this sort of fascination with the Mediterranean world sort of moved through Egypt, moved through Greece, and ended up landing in Rome. And at some point, as a historian, you do have to specialize. And that's kind of unfortunate in a way. And I did end up having to specialize in Rome just because I was interested in it slightly more for whatever reasons. And then here I am, I'm a Roman historian. But that's not to say that I don't have a huge interest in the whole Mediterranean world. And it's trying to figure out how to connect your specialization with what is going on in that broader geographic area, because the more you look, the more complicated and expansive it becomes, which is fascinating. It's going to keep me busy for my whole life, I'm sure.
Yeah, there's lots of little rabbit holes to go down when you the more you learn, you realize there's more that you just don't know.
Yeah, and for me, I don't remember having a particular interest in history, but I liked mysteries a lot as a child. I have about 600 Nancy Drews, so I think that's what got me into this fascination with piecing together stories from incomplete evidence. And then when I was in year 11 and 12, I had an ancient history teacher who just blew me away. She was so fascinating, and I fell in love with the stories she told me about the Julia Claudians and Tacitus. And I never really looked back after that, just went on to do it. But Greece has always interested me. Anyone who knows me knows I struggle with languages. So I was never going to specialize in Greek history because I took one look at those texts and I was like, no, thank you. I'll stick with Latin.
Yeah. Okay. So I guess your backgrounds and that. What would end up leading you to develop the series, The Partial Historians?
Well, actually, we have a scumbag man to thank for that, as in someone who had treated a mutual friend of ours really badly. And so we knew each other, but we didn't know each other that well, but we became close as we sort of rallied around this girlfriend of ours who's going through a really rough time after being treated atrociously by a boyfriend. And it was during a slumber party we started having ideas about starting a podcast, or actually it was meant to be a YouTube channel, but it became a podcast.
Yeah, we did have this moment where we sort of connected across the dining room table after a few drinks with a lot of ladies present, being like, what are we going to do? Because we were going to the same university or not at that stage. We'd gone through the same university for our undergraduate. So we did know each other, but we'd gone to different universities for our PhD. And we'd sort of come together at the end of that process. And like that was wrapping up for both of us at the same time. It just so happened. And we're like, what are we going to do? We'll have done our dissertation. And we were both firmly of the opinion that it wasn't going to be possible because of the nature of the situation with academia to really pursue it for either of us. It's a very difficult field to progress in, even once you've got your qualification. And we're like, look, we're probably going to have to figure out a way to like nourish our interest in history ourselves. And we're like, why don't we do this thing together? You like history, I like history. We could talk about it. We could start a YouTube channel. Then we realized that we had no video expertise and
no money.
And it was on in the podcasting era. I think we're now like ancient podcasters by anybody's measure.
It was pre-serial. So it was before podcasting had really become huge. And there wasn't really a lot of reference points for us. I mean, Mike Duncan was podcasting, but he's been podcasting since the beginning of time.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I don't think we had any idea of what we were doing, really.
No.
We had some scope, and we had an idea of who our audience would be, and then we just kind of started and hoped for the best.
Yeah, we literally just recorded our conversations for years.
Yeah. And it's, I guess, for those listening, we probably can hear that we've all got Australian accents here too. So that's one thing I've started to notice, that there's a few Australians now starting to get involved in, I guess, the history podcast world as well.
Yeah.
You guys are in Sydney, is that right?
We are, yes. We have found it difficult when we're trying to do things like transcriptions and that sort of thing, to find technology that will actually recognize our accents.
This is the toughest gig, because we want it to be accessible, and being a conversational podcast, it means we don't go in with a script.
No.
So we don't start with any material whatsoever. So it's really just the recording to produce a transcription. And some of the things that have popped out so far have been pretty hilarious.
Yeah.
We're just going to keep going.
We don't
Hopefully
even
the tech
think
improves.
we don't even think we have particularly broad accents. I mean, we could go broader, but generally
I was going to say, yeah, like my father's English, so it's like my accent's like fairly it's not ochre Australian, I wouldn't say.
But we could go there.
We could. I could. I don't bring it to the podcast, but I could.
Yeah. And even though we're all in Australia, just to give some context, we probably live, I guess, probably 3,000 kilometres apart. I'm around the centre of Australia.
Yeah, there's no way we could do this in person without flights.
Although I hear Alice Springs is amazing for its art scene, so I'm hoping to get there at some point.
Yeah, it's a nice place. I've lived here for a very long time, moved away and then come back, and I enjoyed here. It's a small town, but you don't have the issues of traffic and parking and all that type of thing to worry about too.
Sounds good.
Yeah, all right. Well, so I guess that's how you got into podcasting and whatever else. But could you give us a bit of an idea of what the show, The Partial Historians, is all about and what you are presenting within it?
Yeah, absolutely. So, as I said, for a few years, whilst we were just doing it as a kind of hobby, I suppose, we just recorded conversations about some of our favorite topics that we'd studied, which was mostly, the emperors and that sort of thing, and Vestal Virgins and Spartacus. But after a few years, we decided we wanted to get more of a focus together. And so we decided that we were going to start telling the story like people like Livy and Dionysius of Halicarnassus had told the story of Rome, which was to progress in a narrative fashion, move chronologically. But we also wanted to have that level of analysis because, after all, we were trying to keep our academic muscles in shape. And so we ended up deciding to read different sources.
Yeah, we'll do a compare and contrast. And this has been pretty where we've been at for years now. Fiona's been reading Livy, I've been reading Dionysius of Halicarnassus, and we've just been comparing their accounts on events as they go through, and they're using some similar source material. So there's lots of parallels. We're going to get into a really interesting phase soon because Dionysius Halicarnassus is going to cut out for a whole chunk. And I'm going to have to find a way to learn the history without just reading Livy.
Hands off, that's my territory.
I wouldn't dream of reading Livy ahead of time.
Yeah, I guess you find the same thing with Greek history too, where you've got one source that's particularly rich, but then all of a sudden it comes to an end and then you have to almost switch your brain to interpreting a new way of how things are written. And I guess especially with Thucydides, he doesn't even complete the end of the Peloponnesian War. And then all of a sudden you have to convert to, I guess, what a lot of people describe as like a second or third rate historian to finish off that period.
Ouch.
But
no judgment.
But yeah, so it presents a few challenges, but it makes it fun at the same time. I think it's what makes doing ancient history quite rewarding and interesting as well.
Yeah, we know we're going to go through some changes, obviously, as we progress through the history, but luckily we tend to move quite slowly. We really are doing history like Livy would have wanted us to. We're moving really analytically in that each episode we generally cover about 1 year, and that's a good episode.
We did under anticipate how much we'd have to say about every single year for which we have very little evidence.
Exactly. But as we go, we know that we'll obviously have to adapt with different source material, but we know that we want to continue to read different source material so that we each come to the show not really knowing what the other one is going to say and being able to compare and contrast the material kind of live on air, I suppose, because that kind of shows what historians do, in terms of looking at source material, deciding which account seems more reliable and which one has particular details for particular reasons and that sort of thing.
Yeah, that sounds very interesting. I guess opposed to what my usual thing is, I take like a foundational source and then try and supplement it with other sources that may disagree in areas, but you sort of just present the ideas forward. But I guess you're coming together with the two different perhaps viewpoints that may oppose would be very interesting, especially for discussion as well.
Yeah, well, at the moment with Livy being Roman and Dionysius not.
He's a Greek, it's okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, so well, I've actually just I've got Livy's first book on my bedside table because I thought I'd start dabbling a little bit back into it as well, but it's been interesting so far. But yeah, it's very slow going because I've got many other things I need to read as well.
Well, luckily our podcast is literally a blow-by-blow recount of Livy. So
Livy is very interesting to read as well, so you'll have fun.
Oh, perhaps I should start reading it in conjunction with your episodes along the way.
That's right.
Well, I guess that's a good segue to get into, I guess, our earliest parts of Roman history. And I guess, like most cities, the earliest history is normally tied up with foundation myths and how cities came about. We've looked at this a fair bit with cities around Athens and Sparta and whatever else, and you usually have gods and heroes that are involved in this. And I'm assuming that Rome is no exception.
Rome has a range of foundation stories. So it's a matter of like which rabbit hole we want to go down first.
Yeah,
really.
there's over 25, I believe. But we're not
going to tell you all of them.
No.
I guess we'll stick to the main ones, I guess.
Yeah.
So one of the clear foundation stories that we get is the story that comes from the idea that Aeneas is the founder of Rome. And this is made really famous with Virgil's Aeneid. And that's where probably most people today know that story. But it does predate Virgil. He didn't come up with that idea, but he really does lean into it and tries to really make it something for Augustus. But Aeneas is not a Greek. I think that's the first thing to keep in mind, even though it's a Greek story, because he is the son of Anchises and Aphrodite. So maybe Greek on his mother's side, but definitely a Trojan on his father's side. And so we get this weird sort of overlay of Trojan Greekness coming through with the Aeneas story. And he sort of picks up things at the end of the Trojan War, does some travels around, ends up in Italy, and then somehow founds a city. That's kind of his jam. But the way that this story kind of unfolds has some different layers to it. So we know that he sort of ends up in potentially Sicily or Italy. The early sources aren't sure about where he ends up. We don't have a good sense that Aeneas is a historical figure, and I think the goddess as a mother is a bit of a giveaway. So there's no sense in which, as historians, we'd be like, oh yeah, that's definitely how Rome got started. But we do have this way in which Rome potentially is trying to tie itself into the broader Mediterranean world with this story, at the same time that the Trojans and the Greeks are potentially also trying to lay a claim to the Western Mediterranean through a connection into Italy, because there is a complicated history of politics that's happening in that peninsula. And so trying to find a way to lay a claim to that becomes an important way of understanding your relationship to them, but also particularly as Rome grows as a power, understanding how maybe this isn't so terrible that your relationship has shifted into a subordinate role to these people, which ends up happening to Greece at certain points. So we have the old epic poets in the Latin tradition and the native indigenous languages of the region talk about this story. So we've got Naevius and Aeneas, both talk about the Aeneas legend. as one of these foundation stories. And this also filters into then historians. One of the earliest Roman historians that we know about that we're really sad that we don't have more evidence for is Quintus Fabius Pictor. And he also talks about the Aeneas story. And we kind of wish that we had that source, because we think his source is one that Livy relies on in the end, and also others like Cato. So there is a sense in which it's not just coming from outside Italy, it's also coming from within at certain points. And so we really get a sense that Aeneas is forming a sort of a dual function for both sets of peoples, as it were, across the Mediterranean in terms of how they understand themselves.
Yep. So I guess at a point where you're, just at a point, I guess, where you're trying to connect Italy itself to the rest of the Mediterranean, and it's finding its way where it sort of sits in, I guess, amongst all those other great sort of places that were developing at the same time.
Yeah, like how do we explain the rise of Rome as a people if we don't understand where they came from? And does it make more sense that they came from us being the Greeks and the sort of the Eastern Mediterranean, or does it make sense that they were somebody else? And I think it's more comforting from a Greek and Eastern Mediterranean perspective to understand the Romans as an extension of themselves.
Yeah. And I've also heard, I don't know what you think of it, but that it's sort of an attempt to go back to show how Rome was such an ancient city as well. Like when you're comparing it to Greece and whatever else, it's trying to stretch back their ancient origins at the same time.
Definitely, because we've got the sense of the Trojan War happening in that sort of late Bronze Age period. And so this means that Rome gets to say that it also has that connection into that long history where the written records aren't very open to us. I mean, there's some that we suspect would have been there, but how they've come down to us, it hasn't happened. So, and how those traditions have shifted through oral traditions into written traditions, that might be where the Aeneas story comes into play as well.
Yeah.
But yeah, like what does it mean to be this place? And the Romans themselves are trying to figure it out. And this is definitely one of the stories that they tell about it.
It's really like the Trojan War was like an epic party where everybody who was anybody was there, and the Romans are just dying to say, oh yeah, I was there.
Me too.
Yeah. Totally there. Yeah. But anyway, the connection I think then happens from this Trojan Greek mythic story with Aeneas. They start working that into something that seems to be an indigenous myth, because the city that Aeneas ends up, settling in and founding is not Rome.
What?
I know. The Greeks do not get that. Or the Trojans do not get that, I should say. So he ends up settling down at a place called Alba Longa, which is not too far from where Rome will eventually be. It's in the region, it's in the area. But there's this awkward gap in time between Aeneas and what most people will probably think of as Rome's true foundation story, which is the story of Romulus and Remus. So they have this idea that there's like generations of kings that go from Aeneas all the way down to the time of Romulus and Remus. So we get to this point in time, and it develops that there are brothers who are in this kingdom of Alba Longa. There's some rivalry over who should have the throne. Okay. And one of them basically stages a coup and kicks the other one out. And he wants to make sure that that brother can never have a claim to the throne. He doesn't want his family to come back and claim it. And so he makes sure that his child, a daughter, can never bear children by making her a Vestal Virgin. So he's probably sitting there going, that's that taken care of. But unfortunately for her, one of the stories that we get is that she's out wandering around one day, by a river or something. And the god Mars sees her and is possessed with this desire for her that, must have her. And this is a woman called Rhea Silvia, by the way. So he rapes her. And of course, he's a god. So wouldn't you know it, she falls pregnant. Eventually this pregnancy starts to reveal itself, no matter how much she tries to hide the fact that she is pregnant. So this king that's, her uncle, who has kicked her father off the throne, he has a difficult choice to make, and he decides he's going to expose the babies because they are unwanted. So he tasks some soldiers or someone to take them down in a basket and, and kill them. And the soldiers obviously decide that they're going to do this by exposing them and putting them in the river, letting the river, do its thing. But as luck would have it, they are just washed down the river a little bit, and then they end up coming to land, where they are happened upon by a she-wolf, apparently, who protects them and suckles them. And these twin babies are, of course, Romulus and Remus, and they're meant to be the most spectacular babies you've just ever seen because they are the children of Mars. The she-wolf, after hanging about for a little while and seeing that no harm comes to the babies, eventually is shooed away by a man who comes across a shepherd, someone who's just tending his flocks around there. It's a bit unclear what he thinks is going on. We're not sure if he's like, oh, babies, I can look after them, or whether he actually has heard about what's happening in the kingdom in terms of, this rivalry between kings and that sort of thing. And he actually pieces it together. He's like, wait a second. I heard about a pregnancy of twin boys, and look, twin boys. We're not really sure whether he puts it all together or not, but either way, he and his wife decide to take in these children and raise them as though they were their own. So probably a good point to mention here that the wife is a very interesting character. She apparently might have been a little bit of a loose woman in her past, maybe even a prostitute. And it's thought that perhaps there's been a bit of a misunderstanding, and that the she-wolf was actually referring to her just in like a nasty way, because the word for prostitute and she-wolf are like the same in Latin, essentially. So it's a bit unclear. But anyway, they have a mum, they have a dad, they have a bit of a rustic country childhood. So they grow up to be, very strong physical specimens. And when they get into their teenage years, they seem to form a gang.
Oh, they do, yeah.
Yeah, very West Side Story. And so they're running around causing havoc in this region. And wouldn't you know it, one of them gets captured. Good old Remus.
Always the lesser of the two in this story, unfortunately.
I know, yeah. So he gets captured by, dun, 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 his granduncle. And as as he's interrogated about his crimes and misdemeanors and that sort of thing, I think the story starts to come out. The penny starts to drop. Romulus also obviously wants to, rescue his brother and that sort of thing. And eventually the whole thing comes out that they are, in fact, the twins that were exposed. And so they are seized with this desire to oust their evil granduncle from the throne and restore the rightful king, which they do. Once they've done that, though, they're like, well, this is kind of your thing, not really our thing. We don't want to take what's yours. So I guess we'll just go and found our own city if
they run off with their man gang. Yeah. Like, maybe we'll hop out of here and form our own boys troop somewhere else.
Exactly. Yeah. So later, rediscovered grandfather. And so they head off into a nearby area. So kind of keeping it in the family and that sort of thing. And this is where the legendary fight between them supposedly takes place. So there are a couple of reasons that we're given as to why this fight might have broken out, but it seems to be that they have a disagreement on where exactly they're going to found the city and who it's going to be named after and that sort of thing. And in some stories, they resort to checking out the birds. So one of them goes and sits on one hill, one of them goes and sits on another hill, and they just sit there for a while, seeing how many birds they can spot when they come back together. Remus is like, oh, I saw this many birds.
I saw 6 birds.
Yeah, and Remus is like, oh yeah, well, I saw double that. So, ha! But anyway, a fight somehow breaks out between them over the whole foundation process. And the legend is that Romulus kills Remus, and therefore Rome is named after him. And he basically makes it like a place of asylum where people who have maybe a bit of a dodgy, shady past in their own city, they can come and start anew in Rome. I think this is his way of attracting people. But yeah, anyone's basically welcome to join. Mostly he's trying to attract men at this point.
Women aren't going to be in a situation where being thrown out necessarily.
Yeah.
Or that they've done crime necessarily.
No.
They're more tradable items in terms of marriage and stuff at this stage. So
yeah,
chances are it's going to attract more men. So the boy gang is going to expand.
Yeah. And that's the beginning of Rome, which is a really bizarre story, which we're pretty sure it's indigenous. It's not something that they stole from the Greeks. I know there's this idea that Rome stole everything from the Greeks, but they didn't. And it seems to have existed even before Fabius Pictor, that early historian that Dr. G was talking about. It seems to be something that they'd been telling for, a couple of centuries by the time we get down to Livy and Dionysius's time. So yeah, it's interesting that they chose to tell this kind of a myth about themselves as like their grand founding. Like, yeah, there's a god in there, but there's also fratricide and gangs.
Gang violence.
Yeah.
As you were talking, sorry, go ahead.
No, you go.
I was just saying, as you were talking, I was sort of just writing down bits and pieces that different elements that seem to line up with other founding myths and I guess stories with other people. And it's just funny how you see a lot of the same elements keep reappearing in different, especially, the gods coming down and impregnating someone, and that's usually the birth of some hero.
Yeah.
And you see that all through Greek foundational stories and myth as well.
Oh, and exposed children who nobody knows their identity until they reach just the right age to actually do something.
And that one was particularly Cyrus of Persia, his founding story. That really stuck out to me as you're talking about that as well.
Yeah.
He would come to control, create Persia in a different manner, but just the lead up to it was very similar.
Absolutely. And we should probably say that the story of Romulus and Remus is pretty well thought to be fictional because we know that Rome existed, as in there were people living on that site hundreds of years before the foundation date of 753 BCE, which is when Romulus apparently did this. And it's really also, he's kind of seen as setting in motion, I think, the gradual establishment of the state of Rome. He sets things in motion. So he attracts men to the city, and then he kidnaps a bunch of women so that the city has a future, which is not great, but he does what he has to do, I guess, in his own mind. He gradually sets up, allegedly, a lot of the things that we would associate with Rome, like the Senate and potentially patricians. This is like the story that we're told, even though we're not really sure that that's how it happened at all.
Yep.
Yeah, but it's also just, as we were saying earlier, it's just one of these stories. Obviously, we had that Aeneas tale as well, which is very based out of that Trojan War mythos. And then we've got the story of Evander, which is coming out of Strabo. And so we're seeing this idea that Rome might also have associations with mainland Greece through an Arcadian sort of connection. And then all of a sudden, this is one that seems to be really particularly a Greek story to try and stake a claim, because they're like, Evander arrived in Italy, according to the story, prior to the end of the Trojan War. So it's predating Aeneas by a good at least 70 years or so.
Yeah.
We're I was here first, guys, don't mind me. And there is an indigenous king in the area already, according to that tale, a guy called Faunus. And so it's there is a proto-Roman thing going on in Italy, but Evander manages to get permission to create his own settlement on a particular hill, and things start from there. And that's where Rome started, according to that idea. And so you've got these layers of people trying to claim different foundation stories as well, I think, that come through in these stories, which is fascinating. And I kind of love that about Rome, where it's if this city had turned out to be nothing, we wouldn't get so many foundation stories.
Yes. And I guess, it comes about because you've got indigenous peoples within the area. You've got colonists coming from Greece. I'm assuming there would be probably people migrating from other regions, whether it be north as well. And once you've got all these people mixing in, you need to find some way to explain how they came about and what they identify with.
Absolutely.
And like you said, Rome became such a big deal that it was quite important to actually be able to find an identifying story to their origins.
Definitely.
Okay, well, I guess that gives us a bit of a look at how it was founded through myth and what ancient writers tell us and whatever else. But I guess if we want to have a closer look at from more of a historical perspective and through archaeology, what can we, I guess, know about how Rome may have came about and what was happening there in those times?
Well, look, we think it goes back to about 1000 BCE in terms of the archaeological remains that have been found on the site.
Yeah, so the stories of like Aeneas and Evander and stuff are hitting that time period quite nicely, actually, because we do have some archaeological remains that stretch back into that late Bronze Age period. It's not a great place, like it's a settlement, and it seems like what is happening is that you've got family clan groups on different hills. Rome claims to have 7 hills, and it's got more than that, actually. It's just that those end up being the ones that they quite like. But yeah, that whole region is kind of this marshy zone that's right next to the Tiber, gets flooded consistently. So you don't want to build in the valley. But what you might want to do is you might want to put your family group up on the top of a hill, and then you can look over to your neighbors on other hills, and you could intermarry across those hills and sort out family relationships and strategies from there. And so we do have huts from about 1000 BCE that we know about, but it's certainly not, it's not a dramatic foundation. It's not like these foundation stories give you a sense that there's a really precise date and time, and they sort of narrow it right down.
A sense of destiny.
Yeah, like Rome ends up saying that, like, you know, it's founded on the 21st of April in 753 BCE. It's so precise. And you're like, is that even possible? And I mean, maybe if it was Canberra, you could say that.
Yeah.
But that would be like saying that we created something really deliberately. But what the archaeology suggests is that we've got this growing settlement that starts to shift somewhere around the sort of 7th and 6th centuries, and really starts to expand its dominance, and we start to get more interesting buildings. And so we can get a sense that the place is growing in wealth. There are more elites at play. And so we have a couple of sites right in the center of Rome where we know that when we dig down into those layers, we start to get into the archaic foundations of the city, and we start to see a couple of really old temples. And this is the stuff that really excites archaeologists, because there seems that we've got a really old temple to Mata Matuta, who is the goddess of the dawn, and a companion temple to the goddess Fortuna. And so these 2 women goddesses at play, and those foundations are sort of sitting at the 7th and 6th century BCE level. But they can also tell that there are prior builds to those temples below that, so heading into that late Bronze Age period. And so they have to keep working on that site, and it's right in the center of Rome. So, you know, a bit tricky here and there, but, you know, it's an ongoing archaeological project. But people are pretty excited about that because those gods also have other temples locally within the broader region. So Mata Matuta has a temple in Praeneste, for instance. And so there's a sense in which this area is part of a broader culture. And there's no doubt about that. And it's not a singular moment of origin. It's something that's developing slowly and building up over time, and slowly increasing in power and wealth.
Yeah, it's basically evolved from what you probably expect, which is a very agrarian village collection of village communities, and gradually builds in significance and cohesion over time.
Yeah, and we can start to see that sort of stuff coming through in the literary source material as well, because a lot of what the early history is talking about is the relationship between Rome and its really close neighbors. And so there is a tussle for power, control of resources. How do you make a switch from just a predominantly agrarian society that's subsistence to one that has enough resources in surplus that it can start to do other things with its time?
Yeah.
And that transition takes hundreds of years. And that's the kind of shift that we're seeing gradually with the architecture. And that's possibly what we can say about that.
But with Rome obviously still being a pretty major city with lots of people living there, it can be tricky to conduct extensive archaeological studies.
Yeah, you can't just willy-nilly go in and dig down under people's houses. Yeah. They will hate you. But I mean, some of the things that are pretty exciting, if we're thinking about the archaeology, have an archaeologist on any site where they're doing any groundworks. And this is why things get built so slowly in Rome. So they're building what is known as Linear C at the moment, the third part of the metro network, and it will be underground. but it is going very slowly because they always find something new archaeologically, and then they have to do a site assessment and really particularly look after everything, document it properly before they can move on. So I think when they initially said that they would start Linear C, they'll be like, it will be 20 years. And I don't think we'll see the end of that building project in our lifetimes. It is really, really quite slow now. But the stuff that they're finding, fantastic. I mean, great for archaeologists and great for historians.
Yeah, absolutely. As you were talking too, I couldn't help but draw, I guess, sort of some parallels to, I guess, Sparta and how similar, I guess, the known origins of that city would be, because it's thought that they wouldn't first develop until around about 1000 BC, yet they still had tales tied up in the Trojan War as well, talking back to an older period. But unlike, I guess, Rome, they would not build on hills. They would build in a valley instead for their defences. And I guess, they would be born out of a series of villages that would all come together that would lead to the actual settlement of Sparta itself. So, it was interesting just to see how close those developments really are.
It's a natural progression, really, isn't it?
Yeah, I think it makes sense because, I mean, how else? It's not like a giant city is going to just come out of nowhere. It starts somewhere. And the human desire, I think, for easy stories where there is a precise point where you can say, this is when it begins. And I think that tells us something about the human psyche rather than what it tells us about like how things generally slowly develop over time. It would make sense for a slow shift from an agrarian subsistence culture to something that is slightly more than that. And different places in the Mediterranean are going through that change at different times. And so I think we can see that in the way that some people rise earlier into that sort of city-state kind of situation. And Rome is behind the 8 ball in all of that. It is developing very slowly compared to, say, what is happening in Greece. And so there's a sense in which maybe some of those ideas are shifting over as well. And people are talking about, like, how can you improve your lifestyle? I don't know. Maybe they have their own podcast.
Wait,
in the ancient world.
Your city was founded by a god?
Wow, mine too. No way. You're telling me if I do the grain this way in the harvest, I will get more yield? And people are like, yeah, like totally, man. They're like, oh, cool. I need to buy that thing.
Yeah, even in Greece, you have different city-states that were developing at different rates as well. I mean, you've got Sparta that their origins don't really exist till 1000 BC, yet we've got evidence that Athens had been in existence since, people living there like in 3000 BC and whatnot. And I think even their stories go back to where they talk about their people were sprung from the earth. They were that old that they were always there.
Really? They just can't remember.
And also their first people weren't necessarily people. I mean, if you're not half snake, are you even Athenian?
Yeah. Yes. But yeah, it's interesting to see how different areas develop, and I guess once you share knowledge and that type of thing, then you start seeing an increase in civilization, especially the closer a city that has developed will then pass its knowledge on to other areas around it. And I guess it's like a domino effect, isn't it, where they all start building up from there.
Yeah, you either adapt or you start to fall behind, don't you?
You get conquered.
Yeah, somebody will conquer you.
Yeah, you get incorporated by someone else. Well, I guess Rome, I guess the indigenous people of Rome and Rome, like we've said, they weren't the original people there the Romans weren't the individual people there. You had another civilization that was developing in Italy at that time, the Etruscans. So could you perhaps just give us a bit of a crash course on the Etruscans, who they were and what we know about them?
Yeah, look, we will do our best. They are a very shady people. It's hard to pin them down to an origin point. They're really interesting because they do seem to have had quite an impact on Rome in terms of, culture and that sort of thing. But where they came from and their story is hard to pin down. And I think it's because there is a lack of detailed written evidence from their culture, which is crazy in one sense because they do seem to have been so significant, but
maybe not surprising in other ways because of the time period that we're looking at when they flourish.
Yeah.
It's kind of pre that really strong literary record?
Yeah, there's tens of thousands of pieces of writing from their society, but they're things like labels. They're not like detailed histories and that sort of thing. And obviously, when you're eclipsed by a place like Rome, well, I mean, is your history really the history that matters here? I don't think so. I mean, Claudius thought so. Claudius thought so. If only we had the Emperor Claudius's history of the Etruscan people, that would be something to get a hold of. That's like number 2 on my list after Agrippina the Younger's memoirs. I want the Emperor Claudius's history of the Etruscan people, because I think that would really be something. But alas, somehow, even though it was written by an emperor, we don't have it.
Yeah, and he was considered quite a scholar, so it's kind of amazing we don't have that.
Yeah, so from what we can tell, the Etruscans are not from the Indo-European language group, which is interesting. So there is some debate about whether they were immigrants to the region themselves, because they're kind of, I mean, they're spread out. They're like Greece in the sense that there is no holistic Etruscan civilization. They're not like a country as we might think of it. There's lots of city-states that obviously share a culture and a language and that sort of thing. And they tend to be mostly grouped together in the north of Italy, but there are some areas further south that they also have influence over, particularly earlier on in the situation. So it's interesting that their language group seems to be a bit of an outlier, perhaps. And there are a number of different stories that have been recorded about where they came from in sources like Herodotus and good old Dionysius of Halicarnassus. Herodotus's version of things is that they sprung from the Lygian people, that the Lygians were going through a famine, and it was obviously a really tough time, and they ended up deciding that they were going to split the population into 2 groups, one of which was put under the leadership of a guy called Tyrannus. And he ended up going and settling in northern Italy with his band, and that's why we get the other name for the Etruscans, which is the Tyrrhenians. But I don't think anybody believes Herodotus. Poor Herodotus. There are stories that come through that the Etruscans, so from this guy called Hellanicus of Lesbos, they talk about the Etruscans being this sort of pre-Greek people, the Pelasgians, who lived in Thessaly before the Greeks get there and then eventually migrate over to Etruria. So their origins are really very much up for debate. I don't feel like we're going to nail that down here. But what we can tell about them, we can largely tell from their grave goods. So there's lots of elaborate, jewelry and that sort of thing that they're famous for making. And that definitely shows that they were engaged in trade with other peoples. They certainly had access where they ended up settling to quite a few different resources which are valuable, which they can either trade or then make into products themselves. So that's probably why they become eventually, relatively prosperous. And certainly the Etruscan civilizations that tend to be on the coast, they tend to develop faster, probably because they are able to trade more easily and they have more contact with other peoples. So they sort of get rolling. We see development, therefore, at different stages in different places in the Etruscan region. The northern places tend to develop a little bit slower than those further to the south. But certainly also the paintings and that's the artwork and that sort of thing that we see gives us some really interesting insights into the Etruscan culture. One of the things I think that's probably worth noting is the fact that from what we can tell from this sort of artwork, it seems like there's a little bit more gender equality potentially between men and women in Etruscan civilization. Seems like women might have been allowed to, go to banquets with their husbands and that sort of thing. And that's something that wouldn't really be okay in the Athenian world if you were, a respectable woman in the classical period. So there do seem to be some interesting things going on there, but exactly what was happening, it's hard to tease out.
Yeah, because we don't have that written culture for them in the same way that we end up with the Romans. They still remain a bit largely mysterious. And the Etruscans sort of came in the 18th century. They're all of a sudden like, we need to understand these incredible. Who are they? Because they've seen these artworks and their frescoes and their funerary goods. And one of those things that stands out for me when we're thinking about maybe gender equality is that some of the grave sarcophagi are paired statues where husbands and wives are posed together in a final banquet. that they will seem to enjoy for eternity, which is just kind of incredible. And then you see some of the sort of the bronze work that comes out from their culture, and they're incredibly detailed. And so their use of technology and their artistry is really top notch for the time period that they're in. So we know that they're very influential, but we don't know how necessarily they were organized except through later interpretations. So certainly Livy and Dionysius of Halicarnassus do talk about the influence of the Etruscans on Rome. There is this whole period in the Roman kingship which seems to be Etruscan kings. And so there is this confluence of this northern influence coming into Rome, whereas Rome tends to try to define itself as being distinctly of Latium, this central area of Italy with an influence that goes south, but resist the influence of Etruria to the north. And yet the stories that they tell about their own history seems to suggest there's a lot of exchange culturally going on. The idea of having lictors carrying these giant sticks around with sometimes the axe head involved comes from Etruria.
And maybe gladiators. That's, everyone's always like, where on earth did the Romans get this idea for gladiatorial games? Like, Etruscans are often seen as being a potential source of influence for the development of the gladiatorial games. Eventually, things like the curule chair, what we call Roman numerals, comes from the Etruscan culture. The fact that the Romans adapt the kind of alphabet they do, that's a process where it seems to go from the Phoenicians to the Greeks, from the Greeks to the Etruscans, and eventually to the Romans. So they have left a huge legacy on our world, even though we know very little about
and let's
them.
not forget chariot racing as well. Like, it seems like the Etruscans are famous for the way in which they cultivate games and entertainment. And so the idea of like the whole hippodrome thing that we have that comes through, which seems to be a Greek thing as well, but is coming into Rome through Etruscan influence. So the Circus Maximus is thought to have been an innovation that is brought down through an Etruscan influence as well. And I mean, that place is huge and you can still see it today, which is very cool. So it's kind of like Etruria is kind of embedded into Rome in really particular ways. And when you look at the map of Italy, the closest neighbor that they have as Romans is the city of Veii, essentially. And Veii is an Etruscan city. So they're right next to the influence of Etruria, and their relationship is like, today, it would be very easy to get there. It's not very far. It's like 16 kilometers between Rome and Veii. So Veii is now part of broader metropolitan Rome. And like, that's how close we're talking about these people being. So it's undeniable that they have an influence. And even the Romans acknowledged that.
Oh, yeah.
But figuring out what it means to be Etruscan, distinct and separate, that's really hard.
Yeah.
And people have talked about the potential of them coming from India, all the way over through and migrating across the north and then coming down into Italy like that. It's kind of incredible that we're not sure still to this day.
It's, I guess, when we look back in the Greek world, you can draw parallels with the Mycenaean culture and Minoan culture as well. We know, very little about them, but they're seen as a very important aspect to the Greeks' past as well. And even their writing is, we get nothing of any sort of stories. It's all just recorded information for palace storerooms and whatnot. So we just get no idea of how they saw themselves and that type of thing as well.
Well, yeah, we know that the Etruscans know about the story of Aeneas and the Trojan War from the representations. So they obviously did tell stories. It's just that they're either not writing them down in great detail, which would probably make sense given when their heyday is, or the records of their writing have been lost or destroyed, which is very possible because, of course, as Dr. G said, they eventually, their territory obviously entirely is swallowed up by Rome. So yeah, who knows what the Romans were keeping and throwing out in that. Yeah,
and what's been uncovered. I mean, in the case of like the Minoans, we don't even know what their stuff says yet. We haven't deciphered it.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly.
And then they're continually finding new documents of Linear B, which was the Mycenaeans language as well. So who knows what may turn up from that. But I think another big thing is, it's often thought that the script that they use didn't convey like emotion and stories too well. It was more of a record-keeping type of script rather. So that may be another aspect too. But
I can sympathize with that. As someone who feels like my life is not falling apart if I'm organized, I can understand the need for record keeping more than anything else.
Yeah. As a rebirth was taking place in Greece, seeing the rise of the Archaic period, a new form of poetry was beginning to take hold. This would be known as Homeric epic poetry, this being some of the earliest works of literature in the Western world. This classification of Homeric poetry would be attributed to one hazy figure from this period, Homer. Over on Patreon, we have begun a 3-part look at Homer, where we will be looking at who Homer was and what elements made up Homeric poetry. We will then be turning to look at the 2 most famous works credited to Homer, the Iliad and the Odyssey, where we will explore the stories and themes found within. If you have been enjoying Casting Through Ancient Greece and have been wanting to support the series, please consider heading over to Patreon and checking out what's happening over there. To say thank you to everyone supporting the series there, I have been releasing monthly bonus episodes that have allowed me to go back over many aspects we have covered in the series previously, provide some more depth on certain areas. Members on Patreon also enjoy such features as ad-free, early release series episodes, monthly video series updates, reference transcriptions of the episodes, and a personal forum where you can ask me anything that will be answered monthly via video. If this interests you, please consider heading over to the Casting Through Ancient Greece Patreon page. Otherwise, you can find other ways to support the series over at castingthroughancientgreece.com and by clicking on the Support the Series button, some through financial support, others just through a little of your time. Thank you for listening and following along with the series. I'm very appreciative of the support the show has been receiving. I look forward to hopefully engaging with you over on Patreon. Now let's get back to the episode. But yeah, so I guess in many sense, from what we know, the Mycenaeans appear to have been from an Indo-European origin as well, but mixing in with indigenous Pelasgian people that the Greeks would refer to. So yeah, it's interesting, different sort of, well, I guess similar sort of things we can line up, but then there's differences along the way as well. And with the Etruscans, you already sort of, I guess, alluded to that they probably had some sort of trade contact with the Greeks as well. And is this how we saw a lot of the earlier ideas from Greece enter into that part of Italy as well?
Yeah, we see a lot of trade.
And then you were saying as well that they would mix in with Rome's foundation and lead to, I guess, the earlier part of their kings and whatnot as well. And so that would be quite a heavy influence on how Rome and its, I guess, kingship would begin. Could you perhaps maybe just go into the Roman kingship and how it developed and what it did look like as it did move forward?
Oh, yes, the Roman kingship. Look, it's like many things to do with this early period of Rome's history. It's more about the hearsay than it is about the fact. And so we have Romulus emerge from that quarrel with Remus, being the only one who gets to live. And he gets to be king. And at that point, he's running a bit of a gangster show, really, on the hills.
Like if the mafia set up a city.
Kind of. It's man heavy, I think it's safe to say. And he's done away with his brother. So he's done a strongman approach to leadership. And so there is a fear factor. I mean, you don't want to go up against this guy. He's willing to murder his own brother to be in charge. So that brings everybody into line. It does seem to be the case that they do realize early on that they're not going to leave much of a legacy if they don't find a way to marry some women and to have a new generation come through. A all-boy gangster group on a hill is not going to make progress. So they do try to make an offer to their surrounding neighbors, being like, look, we've set up this new place. It's very cool. And we'd love to make some connections. It could be a really good chance for you to marry your daughters to some really cool guys.
And their reaction is,
they do get laughed at.
Yeah.
Mostly because Rome has been set up as an asylum for men who have not found their way to be integrated into their own structures And so these are outcasts from these neighboring cities, essentially. And now these guys are coming out with an invitation to marry into their group as if it's some sort of like benefit. And these are families who are like, no, we don't want anything to do with those guys.
Yeah, we're well established. Thank you.
Yeah, those are the people that we didn't want.
Yeah.
Why would we marry our daughters to you?
Yeah.
And the Romans are like, oh, well, that's a bit, their feelings are hurt, understandably. And they're kind of like, we made them a really good offer. And it's like, come on, we've done this all ourselves. We'll build ourselves up from scratch. This is a real bootstrap story. And it's like, and I can't believe that nobody can see the good in what we've achieved here. It's like, we've all come together and we've made this thing and it's kind of nice and it'd be lovely to share it. And you don't even want to have a part of that. And it's like, so they get mad and they rile themselves up and they're like, what are we going to do about this? And they come up with this terrible idea to have a religious festival, invite all of their neighbors. And the nice thing about religious festivals is that it is supposed to be a blanket sort of peace on all neighborly relationships, because you're trying to impress the gods and your relationship with the gods is fundamentally important to your continued existence. So you don't ever want a war to break out of any kind while you're engaging in a religious festival. The Romans decide to play things a little bit differently.
It's like the Sting.
They invite everybody.
Yeah.
And possibly out of a sense of like, well, we're really curious to see what you've done with the place, to be honest. And so it's a bit like staring at a train wreck for them. So I think they're all kind of interested in having a sticky beak. But it is not ideal, because what the Romans do at a certain point during these festivities is they make a signal to each other and then they basically capture all of the available women who are attending this festival and refuse to give them up and force them into marriage through sexual assault. So Rome's foundation story becomes more and more terrible all the time.
Yeah.
But this also gives you a sense of the way that kingship is operating as well, because Romulus has taken this strongman approach and he continues on with it through this action. Now, in trying to cower his neighbors essentially into accepting that this is a place that's going to exist. And those neighbors now being forced to accept that, because the way in which women were considered as tradable goods in this period, they can't get out of these marriages.
Although they do try to fight them.
They do try, but they fail.
They fail.
Yeah. And they eventually do come to some sort of arrangement where the Sabines have been forcibly rejecting this claim of Rome throughout the whole time. And
seems like the majority of the women are from the Sabines.
The majority of the women are Sabine women. So they've really got a lot riding on this situation. And it gets to a point where there is an open battle between the Sabines and the Romans. And it is the Sabine women who come out, who have been captured and are now Roman wives, who are like, really, you're all going to kill yourselves over this situation. And it's like, then we won't have any family. We won't have our fathers, we won't have our brothers, we won't have our cousins, and we also won't have our husbands. So could you please not? And it's at that point where Romulus accepts that he might have to share kingship. And this is fascinating, because you could read this as sort of like a proto-consulship at this point in time. You've all of a sudden got two men who have to divide the rule between them. Romulus tried to get out of this by killing his brother, and he's not able to at this point. And so he has to accept that Titus Tatius, the Sabine leader, will also be the king of Rome. And it's at that moment where you're like, what is kingship in Rome? And what might be the consulship when we see it later? And we're not entirely sure at all. But it's safe to say that kingship in this initial phase is completely messy, pretty disastrous for all of the neighboring peoples. And there is a lot of trauma involved in bringing about a new city under these kinds of conditions.
Yeah, I was going to say the whole idea of kingship, because for us today, when you mention the word king, it brings sort of connotations of someone with, I guess, their own divine rule and whatever they say goes. But in Greece too, you see the word king used, but it can mean a multitude of things, whether it be a strong man who's a leader of a tribe, or a tyrant even. And we often see the word basileus used to describe a king, but it could be used for many different type of leadership roles as well. So I guess the same thing's happening in Rome too, where king can mean multiple different types of, I guess, forms of leadership in certain people as well.
Well, I think it's not what you might think of in that, I suppose most people would associate monarchy and kingship with, the British royal family, because they're probably, one of the more internationally recognized families that still have a monarchy. But Rome is really different in the sense that it doesn't evolve to be dynastic. There are often connections between kings. So there might be some sort of family relationship, whether it's by marriage or by blood, but it's definitely not the case that it has to be a son of the previous king who succeeds. And they do also, they are supposed to have this period between kings called the interregnum, which is where the leading men of the state will take turns sharing power. And then eventually they will choose and elect a king. So it's not what you might automatically think of when you think of a monarchy, which is more a dynastic arrangement. And interestingly, a lot of the people who end up being kings in Rome, I mean, whether they actually ever existed, obviously is a little for some of them, particularly the earlier ones. But these people that are recorded as becoming kings, they're often not Roman. They're often from somewhere else, which is really interesting and has led some scholars to think, well, is that actually a condition for kingship, that you have to not be Roman, which is very strange. So yeah, it's a weird situation that the Romans have got going on, whatever it is.
Yeah. With the kingship period that takes place, just to try and fit it in, I guess, the context of Greek times, what sort of period are we looking at that the kingship would exist for?
So if we're taking the foundation date of 753 BCE as gospel, which I wouldn't recommend, but let's say that for now. If that's roughly the time where we have Romulus, we have our last king get thrown out of power in 509 BCE. So we've got this good chunk of time where we've got kingship at play from a Roman perspective. And it's at that moment in 509 where they're like, that's it. We can't deal with kingship anymore. We're going to try something else. Yeah. No, we don't like it anymore. It's not working for us. We need something new. And this is where a system like having the interregnum, which they've had at play apparently the whole way through this kingship period anyway, becomes really useful because they're already familiar with sharing power and going through a phase where they put certain people in charge to share it while they try to figure out what to do next.
Yeah, it's not like they're like, oh my God, we don't have a leader. What do we do?
Yeah. Quick, collapse.
Yeah.
What would lead, I guess, in that? Well, it's interesting to see that those dates, I guess, kind of roughly line up with the archaic period of Greece. Like 753 pretty, very, very close to, the foundation of the Olympic Games, which is often recognized as the official start of the archaic period. And then 509, which is pretty close to where Cleisthenes takes over in Athens and seen as, I guess, some important democratic sort of reforms taking place there. And then it wouldn't be too long afterwards where, I guess, the classical age would begin. But in Rome, what would lead to the downfall of, why would the kingship come to an end?
Well, again, it's whether you believe the myth or whether you believe the scholarship that's trying to dissect the myth. The myth is that, again, we have, unfortunately, a woman being treated really terribly, which seems to be a theme that runs through our show. But anyway, so basically you have this family in charge, the Tarquinii. The particular Tarquin that is in power at this point in time, Tarquinius Superbus, is not a nice guy. He's got to power through a coup himself, and his wife is also awful. They're just like the most atrocious pair, and probably in the Roman kingship period. I'm going to go on a limb and say that they're the most awful people you will meet in that entire period. So his name, Superbus, it indicates that he's like proud or arrogant. So, not a particularly nice guy. He's predictably a pretty strong man king as well. He's definitely very firm and demanding of his people, and the kinds of things that he makes them do doesn't go down well, like making them work on, building projects and stuff, like, really common people. They're not keen on that whole idea. Predictably, he's probably not a great parent in terms of instilling fabulous virtues in his children. And so his sons are pretty entitled as well, I would say. The story is that They're in the middle of a military campaign with a nearby place. And actually Ardea, I think it is, funnily enough, we've just been talking about Ardea in our podcast. They're besieging Ardea. So it's not like a battle. They're more, hanging around and waiting for the people inside to either starve to death or give up. So obviously there's a lot of boredom in the camp. So a bunch of the more elite guys, so some of them are related to the royal family and some of them are just, fairly elite clans. They're all sitting around talking and drinking, I would say. And they get to talking about whose wife is the best. And so, they're drunkenly like, no, shush, listen. My wife is the best. There's nobody that can beat my wife. Anyway, so they decide that there's no way to settle this drunken argument than if they actually just go and check it out for themselves. So they seemingly travel to each other's houses, which geographically, I'm not going to get into whether that makes sense or not. But anyway, they travel to each other's houses, and wouldn't you know it, one by one, the women are having a great time while their husbands are away, doing all the things they're not supposed to do, which is like having parties, having friends over, drinking wine, which is a big no-no if you're a Roman woman. It's a sign of a loose woman. You're not supposed to do that. Until, of course, they get to the house of a woman called Lucretia, whose husband is a guy called Collatinus. Yes, there you go. So a woman called Lucretia, who's known to be very, very virtuous. And she's doing what a Roman woman should be doing, which is she's sitting around with her slaves, supervising them whilst they do some wool work, and she's doing that as well. So they're just working away into the night, very virtuously, very modest. One of the king's sons, a guy called Sextus, conceives a huge passion for her, what I would call the librarian complex, where he's like, wow, she's so good and pure. I
so
must
virtuous.
have her. Yeah, exactly.
I must defile her some way.
Yeah. So there's a couple of different ways that it plays out, but one way or another, he ends up going back to her house at a later date, like a few days later. And because they are actually loosely related,
they're part of the broader clan group.
Yeah, they're part of a broader clan group. And so this is not super suspicious. He's allowed to rock up and be like, hey, can I crash here for the night? And she's supposed to be like, sure. So of course she is, because she's amazing. So she puts him up, they have dinner, and then everyone goes to bed. He waits until it's very late at night and everyone is asleep. He sneaks into her room and he's like, so this is going to happen. It's going to happen. She's too virtuous for that, of course, and says, I don't think so. This is only for my husband. Thank you very much. But he is not going to be put off that easily because he's terrible and he's from a terrible dynasty. And so he says, okay, how about this? I'm not asking your permission. I'm just going to do it. And she's like, I'd like to see you try. Anyway, this goes on for a while. But eventually he's like, okay, I tell you what, I am going to kill you if you don't have sex with me right now. And I'm then going to kill a male slave, put his body in the bed next to yours, and say that I walked in on the two of you having sex and I rightfully killed you both on the spot for being so disgusting and for breaking all the rules.
And it was quite legal for a Roman man to do this if he caught people. So this was absolutely terrible as a threat.
Yeah. Because she knows he's going to be able to do it. No problems. So she has to submit. So she submits, he does the deed and leaves, presuming that he's going to get away with it, I suppose. But he hasn't counted on just how virtuous Lucretia is. She immediately summons her husband and her father to come and talk to her. And she's like, bring along some friends that you trust as well. So they bring along this guy called Brutus, who's also part of this, royal clan. He's related to them. Anyway, so they come along. When they arrive, she tells them the whole story and they are furious. They are so mad that Sextus Tarquinius would have done this. They're like just typical of the Tarquins, more of the same, disgusting, outrageous behavior, thinking they can get away with everything. She then says, okay, now that I've told you my story and I want you to promise that you're going to do something about it, I'm going to kill myself. And she pulls out a dagger and they're like, whoa, hang on a second there. You actually didn't do anything wrong. Sure, you've had sex with someone who wasn't your husband, but it was against your will. It was just your body, not your mind. You were loyal all the time in your mind. You don't have to do this. And she's like, I do have to do this because I don't want any woman cheating on their husband, committing adultery in the future, and using me as some kind of reference point. You know, the expectations are clear. You don't have sex with anyone who's not your husband. I need to die to, you know, live by the morals that I've been raised with, you know. And so she kills herself. They are, of course, devastated, particularly her husband, father. They go to pieces. But Brutus, on the other hand, he remains composed. And he says, look, guys, this is really tragic, but we actually need to do something about this more than crying. We need to seize this moment to raise the people against the exploitation of the Tarquins. And so they gather up her body, they display it in the marketplace, they call people around and tell them the tragic story. They also remind them of all the other things that the Tarquins have been doing wrong for like decades. And they do rouse the people up, apparently, to the point where they're willing to not just kick out this king, but get rid of monarchy forever so that they will never face such a system of, I suppose, exploitation and that sort of thing. Again, this idea of single man rule, they're just like, nah, not having it, not ever again. Thank you very much. And so that's how the kingship ends up coming to an end. The king and his family lose support. And even though they try very hard,
they do try to regain
They
power.
do try to regain power. The Tarquins bounce around a little bit for a while after that, but they never manage to. So that's how the kingship comes to an end.
Yep. And would that just then transfer into what would become the Roman Republic as well?
Yeah, like this is the moment where Brutus really comes into his own, because he has been a character who has been in the background of the Tarquin dynasty. And it's this kind of moment where he starts to really shine, and he becomes the sort of catalyst point for like what comes next. And this is where it seems that the first idea for this consulship comes up. Having said that, the consulship, again, is something that we're not sure when it develops. And the Latin that we have for it as well, that title seems to come up maybe a bit later. So we're not really sure if we're dealing with actual consuls at this point, but there's certainly a power sharing arrangement that seems to come into play as a result. That's maybe an extension of the interregnum, and is sort of mapped onto that a little bit as they try to figure out how this will evolve. But as far as our analytic historians are concerned, this is the moment where the consulship starts, and we start to have names of consuls for the years. And they do keep records of this kind of nature, and there are a few different types. And that seems to be the point where they're like, yes, we've got something to name the years by, and it's actually at least 2 people, not 1.
Yeah, this idea of checks and balances, I suppose, definitely has a place in the Roman system. And it is a bit of a confusing time, because there are lots of theories about what is actually going on. Like, the Tarquins we know were not Roman. Okay, so we know that they come from this sort of Greek Etruscan
They
background.
come from Tarquinii, which is an Etruscan city.
Yeah.
So they're definitely Etruscan.
But there is that Greek connection, isn't there, in that they went there because weren't they not doing well in Corinth?
There was their forefather is an exile from Corinth who ends up settling down in Tarquinii because of his trade connections that he has there, marries into a very nice Etruscan family. And this is going back. This is not necessarily Tarquins themselves, but this is certainly an Etruscan connection and a Greek connection into the Roman kingship. And so that idea of the Etruscans also having a Greekness about them starts to filter into some of these stories as well.
Yeah, and so it's some people have suggested that this period, it's not so much that the Tarquins were chosen to be the kings of Rome, but that they had captured Rome. But not everybody agrees with that idea. It doesn't 100% make sense, particularly with the way that it all ends. It is also possible that what we're seeing in 509, if again we take that date to be like the date, is maybe some sort of aristocratic coup, because Brutus is, of course, part of the dynasty. He's part of this family. So that's a possibility, I suppose. But again, some people think it doesn't quite quite add up in the way that the story is told. And certainly, again, it probably was a bit more of a gradual change rather than the sharp, right, we've had kings for ages and it's all we know, but now we're starting this new system and this is how it's going to be. It's probably a bit more of a gradual shift.
Yeah, those power vacuums are messy at the best of times. It's probably going to take a while.
Yeah, because one of the people that Tarquinius Superbus turns to for help is this guy called Lars Porsena, who's the king of Clusium. And he is like, come on, help me, get back my power. That would be great. Again, some people have suggested that maybe Porsena captured Rome at this point in time. Okay. Maybe that's how the monarchy was either was abolished, or there's a lot of questions about what Porsena's involvement actually means for Rome. Like, was he actually trying to restore the monarchy, or what was he actually trying to do there? So yeah, there's a lot of questions that I don't think will satisfactorily be answered unless we find new evidence.
It seems to be a very common, I guess, story, but like looking at how political systems change, it's not so clear cut as we may get from the sources, but it seems to be evolving over even up to a number of generations. Like in Athens, we don't see democracy doesn't just all of a sudden arrive one day. It's been unfolding for generations to where it gets to its eventual point. And I guess, going from a kingship to a republic, you're not going to just one night wake up and go, well, we've got this new system now in place.
Especially because the Roman system is so intricate. Like, there's so many different levels to it. I mean, that's what we've been discovering going through the early history of the Republic. You see them account for like, oh, here's another layer of the state, and here's another thing. They even show it as evolving gradually in terms of all the bells and whistles that end up getting, added on. So yeah.
So I guess you've got many probably generations taking place that would see the Republic come to its ultimate form. Now, from what I understand, a Republic is, I guess, on its most basic level, it's monarchy balanced against oligarchy, balanced against democracy in some way. Once the Republic had developed in Rome, what did their system look like?
Well, there are allegedly these consuls, which, as we said, supposedly date back to 509 BCE. So the idea is you have two men who are the lead magistrates sharing the power. So that's meant to be something that's happening there. It's possible that they existed before. It's possible that they didn't exist till much later. And that actually what we're talking about are people called praetors, which is a position that does exist in Rome's history, but whether that's the term that we apply for these lead magistrates at this point in time, it's, again, very, very unclear.
We have some complexities here because praetors end up being known much later for being military leaders. And the consulship ends up having a military component as well as a religious and magisterial component to it. So the consulship becomes this sort of grab bag of really important layers of power, and the praetorship seems to end up getting separated out at some point as distinctly military only. But the way that develops and the nature of that, we're just really not sure in this early period. And because we've got this idea of praetors coming through in this early republic and maybe not consuls till later, there's sense in which maybe the powers are also shifting around as the system develops is at play.
Yeah. And these people, whoever they are, whatever their title is, are elected by a group called the Comitia Centuriata. So this is a grouping of the people, and they're only meant to hold power for 1 year. So again, this idea that nobody's going to hold power in quite the same way that a king would, that's not supposed to be happening anymore. And they would take turns to hold the fasces, which are like the symbol of their imperium. And this is, again, something that stems probably from the Etruscans. We think that this is where that symbolism comes from. But the fasces are basically like a bunch of rods which are bound together with an axe. And the idea of that symbolism is that the consuls have the power to beat you with the rods and chop off your head with the axe. So no doubt.
Yeah. So when we talk about power, it's literally physical power.
Yeah.
But we should be under no illusions that we're looking at a democracy that we would recognize here.
No.
The Comitia Centuriata is not democratic by anybody's stretch of the imagination. People vote in blocks, and they vote in order of their seniority in terms of their citizenship. And it's a first past the post. So it would be a sense in which you might never have to vote in anything if you're one of the lower tier citizens, because the decision would already be made before you had to cast a vote.
Yeah.
And so there's a sense in which it's open voting as well, not secret voting. So everybody can see, so we know when past the post happens. And this means that the groups that traditionally hold most of the power get to really express what they want first. And you've got that complex relationship between patron and client, which is always at play in Rome throughout its whole history, where if your higher up dude who's helping you out with a job or something and you owe him votes a certain way, boy, you do not want to vote differently from that guy, because he's going to see it.
Yeah, it can really screw up your life.
it's going to have real problems for how you conduct your business and how you look after your family. So you do not want to go against those kinds of relationships. So everything is kind of stitched up in a non-democratic way.
Definitely. And we can see this in the sense that by 494 BCE, so the Republic hasn't existed for that long, we have this event called the First Secession of the Plebs, which is where this mysterious group called the Plebeians, who is not everybody. That's not everybody who's not patrician at this point in time. It does seem to be a particular group, but exactly what characterizes who belongs to that group is very unclear. This group decide, you know what? If you don't want to pay attention to us or listen to what we have to say, then we're out of here. And so they head on out and establish themselves on a separate hill, and they're like, we're just going to sit here and set up our own society.
This is our hill now, and you can come and treat with us when you're free and available, but we want nothing to do with your city and its stupid ways.
And they have to send out a bunch of Roman nobles who could be like, come on now, look, we can see that you're mad, but come on, don't you want to come back? Don't you want to be part of the gang again? It'll be great. And this is when they get the Concilium Plebis and the Tribune of the Plebs, apparently, which is meant to be obviously recognizing their position within the state and that they need to have representation and protection from the elite in this society, who, let's call them patricians, although again, who are they? Don't know. They seem to be some people that are probably wealthy, I would imagine, but more importantly, they have a stranglehold, I think, on political but crucially religious positions within the Roman state. So, yeah, not really sure really much more than that, particularly at this early stage, but there does seem to be some conflict between the patricians and the plebeians during the Republic for a couple hundred years.
So like many of the questions that you've asked us, in summation, we're not sure, but it's complicated.
Yeah, we know it's complicated. Yeah.
Very similar to Greek history. So all we can do is make the best guess on what we've got.
Yeah. And I think the final thing to note is that there is a Senate. It's not the same kind of Senate that you would imagine from, say, like the late Republic and the early Empire. It, I think, would be safe to say would be a group of elite people in society who are influential, but any decisions that they make, they're not binding by law at this point in time. And they're probably a smaller body than we might imagine at this point in time. And then if there was an emergency, the Romans do acknowledge that having lots of different groups of people talking about what's the best plan of action is not ideal. And so they also have this emergency position where if they really need someone to make decisions quickly, someone that they trust, then for about 6 months, they have a position called dictator, which can be filled by someone who comes in and sorts out the problems. And he gets to nominate a deputy who's called the Magister Equitum, master of the horse. And they are supposed to sort things out quick, smart, and then resign the power and not hold on to it.
Yep. It's so I guess you've got like an oligarchic rule, I guess, in the Republic taking place, which again is very similar to archaic Athens, where you've got it ruled by the nobles. Even though you've got an assembly in name, its beginnings were more the people came to the assembly and they were told what was happening.
Yeah,
it's not so much a vote taking place.
That is definitely the impression we get of at least the first, I would say, like 60 years of the Republic.
Yes, it's a lot of we'll tell you what's going on.
Yeah.
You just have to turn up and do
And when
thing.
people question it, they're like, excuse me? Are you questioning me? Outrageous.
All right. Well, I thought perhaps we could go back to some of the connections that Rome had through trade. And I wanted to, I guess, specifically focus on what would become one of their most sort of famous enemies, which would be later down the track. But in my series, we recently, when we looked at Sicily, we sort of brought up connections with the Phoenicians and Carthage and trade connections that are happening in Rome. So I thought you could perhaps just take us through some of those early interactions that Rome had with Carthage and the Phoenicians in the area during around like the 6th century into the 5th century BC.
Yeah, sure. So we don't have a huge amount of detail at this point in time. I mean, Rome is more concerned in the 6th century and the 5th century with just holding on to power in their own little region, even lose their own city. You know, we're constantly told that there are people at the gates and that sort of thing. But we do apparently have some treaties happening between Rome and Carthage. So possibly the earliest one that we have a record of goes back to 507 BCE. So that's like right at the beginning of the Republic. Coincidence?
I think not.
Yeah, exactly. So it might be that they are recognizing that there is this new system, or that there are new people in power in Rome, and therefore good time to have a treaty, perhaps. We find this referred to in Plebis, who talks about how it's, you know, just been uncovered that it goes back this far of their relationship. And the treaty more or less just says that the Romans and the Carthaginians agree to be friends and that they're not going to act in a way that is against the other's interests. So that seems fairly friendly. And that is therefore talking about the Romans saying, okay, well, we're not going to sail past this particular point. And when we're trading with places like Libya and Sardinia, we will stick to certain conditions in terms of how that trade takes place. The Carthaginians, on the other hand, they say, okay, well, we're not going to hurt people who live in Ardea, Antium, Lavinium, you know, all these places which are very close to Rome and within their circle of influence. And certainly these are people who I would think of as Rome's allies, essentially. So they're, I'd say, looking out for the people in that sort of area. So it's interesting that it goes all the way back to this time period. And it also indicates that Rome must have been recognized as being, you know, influential in the area of Latium and being in control of, you know, of the little circle, about 100-kilometer radius around the city of Rome. So yeah, that's kind of the earliest one we have. Otherwise, we have references to some treaties that spring up in sort of 348 and 306, and they're more referred to as being the renewal of previous treaties. So probably would indicate that they're again laying down this idea of, okay, this is our sphere of influence, this is your sphere of influence, this is how we're going to behave so that we don't annoy each other, which, given what will happen later, obviously is kind of amusing that they're so concerned about not treading on each other's toes.
I think it's interesting that these things are coming up in this early period with Carthage, because Carthage is one of these cities that feeds into that broader Phoenician group, which is this loosely held collective that's been at play since at least the late Bronze Age. And they kind of have two waves of influence. And that first one comes in that late Bronze Age period where they start to really push out from the east into the western Mediterranean, and they set up a whole bunch of places, and Carthage is one of them, Palermo is another. They're interested in Spain, they're interested in a whole bunch of things. They end up on Ibiza, which is obviously the coolest place for them to end up. Go Phoenicia. And so they've got this spread where that spread allows them to control a whole bunch of natural resources, which means that the Phoenicians are controlling luxury trade for a long time in the Mediterranean. So the idea that they would even care about Rome, which in this same sort of early period is a whole bunch of haystacks and a little bit of a settlement on top of some hills, is amazingly unlikely. But yet, by the time we get to like 507, it's considered worthy enough of some sort of contact with Carthage. And so this means that something has really changed for Rome, I think, in this period. But those legacies of that sort of luxury trade good coordination that the early Phoenicians engaged in is still at play in this period. And Rome doesn't have anything to really offer into that. It's basically got salt as a resource, and that's about it. Like everything else that it's doing, it's kind of trying to figure out its own government, according to our sources. So whatever Carthage and thus broadly as a proxy for broader Phoenicia might be seeing with Rome might be something just sort of preemptive at this stage, because it's not at all clear that Rome is in any way a great naval nation. It's built a harbor at Ostia, but that's about it.
Yeah,
and they sort of don't see themselves as naval people either.
Yeah, I mean, we know that they have built some, relatively impressive temples by around this time, or at least at around this time they start to construct it. I think they just recognize that Rome has influence in this area, and Carthage has definite interest in the Tyrrhenian Sea in terms of where they're operating and that sort of thing. And so it does seem to provide some acknowledgement that Rome has become something of significance. But yeah, it is wild to think of. Yeah.
And Rome is definitely getting hooked into the Phoenician luxury trade goods network at this time. So this like 6th century period, because we're seeing evidence of the Phoenician made trade goods popping up in Calabria, Campania, Latium, Etruria. So there's this real period of growth in trade exchange that's happening throughout the Italian peninsula with Carthage and broader Phoenicia in this sort of 6th century period. So it's all of a sudden, it's sort of kind of, there's been a flourishing of trade connections. So that means something, because in order to have that trade, you've got to have some sort of wealth generation to make it possible. There's really got to be significant elites at play to make that kind of trade viable and possible. Like, who wants these goods, and are they even going to use them, and how would they be used, and what do they represent? And so for that to all be happening suggests that the whole Italian peninsula is going through this new sort of flourishing phase. And the Phoenicians, as a trading people who do control lots of the raw materials for luxury goods and some of the production of them, are now interested, because they're like, wait a minute, this whole network is now opening up to us, and we've got an in here that we might need to pursue. So setting up some relationships. I don't think it's feasible that Carthage would only be talking to Rome in this period. No. They'd definitely be talking to a whole bunch of other city-states throughout the Italian peninsula as well.
Definitely.
I wonder too if there's, because there was such an explosion of trade taking place, like you had obviously Phoenicians, you had the Greeks that were populating many areas. If there was like a competition of securing certain trade routes between the different places, so you just wanted to try and get in earlier as well. So perhaps that threshold of who you would trade with was brought down a bit lower as well in that period.
How dare you?
Are you saying Rome's not that important? Me too.
But yeah, it was a very busy period. So I think everyone was trying to secure their interests when they could.
Yeah, definitely.
But yeah, it's very interesting. Well, I guess this kind of roughly brings us up to, I guess, where I wanted to bring this episode, and that was up to where the Greek and Persian wars would break out in Greece, and gives us a bit of a context of what was actually happening over in Rome during the same period. But just to round out the episode, I thought we could just go back over, or sort of look forward a little bit into the early actions of the Roman Republic and what sort of dangers they faced as, I guess, the near future would develop.
Many.
Mostly internal problems, to be honest. They're very, very caught up in their own sense of self at this period of time.
Yeah, I think the way that we can read, there's this conflict, as we say, that keeps coming up in our narrative sources called the conflict of the orders, or the struggle of the orders, which, as I said, was between this group called the patricians and this group called the plebeians, who do not correlate with our later understanding of what a patrician and a plebeian is precisely. Like, there's some overlap, but yeah, who belongs to those groups and why they're clashing exactly is sometimes a little unclear. But certainly there are issues about who has control of political offices, who has the right to make decisions that apply to everybody. There's also much more, I suppose, sort of like foundational concerns in terms of who has control of land. This idea of debt, so debt bondage is definitely a problem in early Republic in terms of people getting themselves into holes they can't dig themselves out of, and, maybe ending up in slavery and that sort of thing. So there are definitely some real issues. And then, as far as we can tell from the archaeology, but also seemingly what's going on in our accounts, it would tie in with that, I think. by the time you get to the middle of the 5th century, it does seem to be a bit of a low point for Rome. There's not a lot of temple building going on. There seems to be a bit less trade going on, as far as we can tell from pottery remains and that sort of thing. And it doesn't seem to be that only Rome is going through a bit of a rough patch at that point in time. It does seem to be affecting other places like Carthage at the same point in time. So they have this rocky beginning where they're probably just sorting out what exactly their new system is going to be. And there's obviously competing interest involved in that. And there's also your typical class issues. But then there's also a rough period in terms of, general prosperity in the region, I would say.
Yeah, it seems a pretty unstable period. And this internal struggle seems to be coming out of a lack of resources to a certain extent. So even while at the same time we have this sort of uptick in what appears to be connections with trade, we also have what it like in terms of the relationships between the different populations, and in order to cultivate enough grain in order to sustain the population. And that seems to be implicated in this conflict of the orders, as it were, because one of the key issues for the Romans that is coming up is this idea of the ager publicus, the public land, and how is that utilized and divided. And there seems to be this strong sense that public land is actually being co-opted by the elite for their own specific purposes, locking out the lower classes from the potential to engage in more farming and to look after themselves. And this is a huge issue, because if Rome can't field an army at any particular point in time, it's not a stable period in terms of its neighbors. It doesn't have particular allies, according to our written sources, even though we get this sense that they're definitely hooked into relationships with people along the coastline. There are some internal relationships that are not going well. And so they have these issues where they need to be able to put people in the field. And they also need to be able to feed that army. And are they able to do it? And it seems like often they struggle. And so this early Republican period is not a period of huge flourishment for them, because they're trying to figure out so many different things about how they operate, because they need to have that surplus in order to gain some sort of dominance. And it seems like they're pretty interested in doing that, but can they do it? And how would they go about doing it under these circumstances? So they've got a whole bunch of issues that they really need to figure out. And it looks like, for all money, that Rome isn't going to make it, to be honest. The early Republic is a chaotic time.
Yeah, especially when you consider that there's then also the attack by the Gauls, which really knocks them on their ass by the time you get to the 4th century. It does seem like that. It seems very unstable in terms of whether it's actually going to stay. So Rome might be recognized as being an influential power in that region, but it's not unassailable. It's not the Rome where everyone's like, the power and might of Rome. And so there are neighboring people that
there are people that hate them. The Volscii hate them. Their close neighbors hate them.
The
Aequians hate them. Every time it's time for harvest season, it's over, and it's like, let's put some bodies on the field. And the Volscii and the Aequii are always like, yes, let's get Rome this time. We're so close. We could knock these guys over. And so they've got consistent perennial enemies because they're trying to expand their sphere of influence and their holdings of land so they can support a bigger army. And obviously their neighbors don't want that, because that's encroaching on them.
Yeah.
And so it's a complicated time for central Italy in terms of how it's going to distribute its population and resources.
But you wouldn't know it from reading particularly Livy. It sounds like Rome is the Rome of Augustus. Like they're this mighty place with this crazy destiny, and these battles are the most epic things you've ever heard of, when really they're probably like little skirmishes with like 10 guys on a field, like, take that.
Yeah, more along the lines of tribal warfare instead of great armies opposing one another.
Probably. I mean, there is an army, but a lot of what we hear of, I think, is also just like low-level banditry. So.
Yeah, and I think it's a common story, I guess, even with Greece, when a lot of its development, there's a lot of troubles taking place, especially in Athens. You've got the same problems of people becoming burdened to others, where they can't pay their debts, so they end up in slavery as well.
Yeah.
They have problems with feeding the population, and then they have to resort to founding colonies to offload excess population elsewhere. But and then until they finally reach their greatness in the classical age. But yeah, again, it's depending when you read about these periods is how they sort of come across to you and who's telling it as well.
Yeah, I suppose the interesting connection between Greece and Rome at this point in time, which we might mention to maybe wrap up, is that one of the big things that ends up happening supposedly as a result of the conflict of the orders, but maybe not, is that the Romans decide they're going to write down and codify their law code. So obviously they have laws, they've had laws, but the idea of maybe who has access to them and whether it's just in the head of the elite or whether it's actually written down somewhere is a little less certain. And so allegedly they send off a fact-finding mission to Greece to look at the law codes of Solon and that sort of thing. And that apparently has some influence over the 12 tables, which is Rome's codified law code from the 450s.
Yep. Again, like Draco and Solon in that in Athens, where we see all that sort of stuff codified as well. But yeah, well, I guess that probably brings us to a good point to wrap things up. So thank you, Dr. Greenfield and Dr. Radford, for coming on to talk to us today. I greatly appreciate the time you've taken to spend with us and share your knowledge, and I'm sure all my listeners appreciate it too.
Been a pleasure. It's nice to talk to someone else who has an Australian accent.
Very happy to share.
But just before we do close off, perhaps you could just tell everyone where they can find you guys and your show.
Ooh, yes. So you can find us wherever you listen to fantastic podcasts. We are the Partial Historians, and we've been looking at the history of Rome from the foundation of the city for quite some time. So I'd recommend starting with our Romulus and Remus episode if such a thing might interest you. And we're on Twitter, we're on Facebook, we're on Instagram, and watch this space, we're going to try to venture into YouTube.
No worries. All right. Well, thanks for coming on, and I hope everyone checks out Partial Historians. Well worth a listen.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I hope everyone enjoyed the interview with Dr. Radford and Dr. Greenfield. It was good to piece back together some of that early Roman history that I had read so long ago. It was also very interesting to see some very similar themes develop as what we have encountered in our series so far, as well as a number of parallels. I also hope that our talk today has provided some context in time with the development of Rome compared to what was taking place in Greece. If you're interested in getting to grips with Roman history and have yet to come across the Partial Historians, I would highly recommend checking out their show wherever you get your podcasts from. Also, they are very active in sharing ancient history on social media, so look out for them on Twitter, Facebook and Instagram. Next episode, we'll be back on track in the Aegean. We'll be picking back up from the birth of the Delian League. We will now focus on the first campaign of the League after their inception, taking us through to just beyond 470 BC. This will see us focus just on events in the Aegean, but as we move forward, we'll be revisiting these 10 years to look at the political developments that were unfolding on the Greek mainland. Thank you everyone for your continued support, and a big shout out to all those who have found some value in the series and have been supporting it on Patreon and other various ways. Your contribution is truly helping me grow the series. I would also like to give a personal shout out to Francisco Alvarado, Christoph Mandy and Andrea MD, who all recently signed up as supporters over on Patreon. I greatly appreciate your decision to do so. If you have also found some value in the show and wish to support the series, you can head to www.castingthroughancientgreece.com and click on the Support the Series button, where you can discover many ways to extend your support to helping the series grow. Be sure to stay connected and updated on what's happening in the series, and join me over on Facebook or Instagram at Casting Through Ancient Greece, or on Twitter at Casting Greece. And be sure to subscribe to the series over at the Casting Through Ancient Greece website. I hope you can join me next time for episode 53, Debut of the Delian League.